Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 40, I'm not kidding, 40 noteworthy but mostly dead conductors with loads of recordings worth exploring. 40 of them. Why am I doing this? Well, because I've been making these conductors lists and I've been getting these outraged comments. How could you not mention so-and-so? And I'm shocked that you didn't talk about such and such. And so-and-so just demands the attention that you refuse to give him, you evil and despicable man. Well, I'm taking care of most of that, not all of it. How is that possible? I'm batting cleanup, as we say in baseball terminology. Here are a lot of the names, a lot of the names that you've demanded, insisted upon, and really a lot of them are very good because, we just had some controversy with my list of forgettable historical conductors, which included some major names. And one of the things I was at pains to point out, which of course most people ignored because they didn't watch the video and they didn't want to listen to what I had to say about it. They just looked at the list and went, ah, like that. No, most of these people were trained professional musicians. I guess all of them were. And they all had a few great performances in them. All of them, without exception. Some of them had a lot more crappy performances in them. That's true too. But they're worth exploring for the great stuff because that's what we do. We're looking for the great stuff. We want to make those discoveries and share them. And so here is the list of some of these are wonderful conductors. Some of these are major names. Some of them made lots and lots of records. Some of them made lots and lots of really good records. But there's just too many. There's too much stuff. I've said this before. We all started, remember this, way back at the dawn of time, with the top 20 conductors, which was in addition to my top 10 living conductors, which I did a couple of years ago, and a bunch of you asked me about because you weren't hanging out with the crowd at that point. And so, and it's a constantly changing thing too, isn't it? So this is the name of the game. It's finding the really great stuff and getting the names out there, things that people should look for. So that's what I'm trying to do. And, whether you put it in this list or that list, people take that a little bit, I think, too seriously. The point is not whether they're on or off the list. The point is that we are constantly listening and constantly discovering and constantly refamiliarizing ourselves and talking about these things. So here we are, 40, mostly dead, but not all of them. There are a couple who are still kicking around. So here we go. Antonio de Almeida. I thought we'd begin with an A, even though I don't alphabetize the rest of them. He was a good friend of mine. And so I have to confess, there's a bias to say he's a good friend of mine. Actually, I'm not really biased towards his recordings particularly, but he made a lot of very interesting recordings. He was a major supporter. He was French opera, romantic French opera, and he made quite a few recordings of that. His very first recording for RCA was Chausson Viviane and Florent Schmitt, The Tragedy of Salome, and some other stuff like that. Just wonderful, wonderful stuff. He was a delightful man, and we're still waiting for Australian Eloquence to reissue his middle period Haydn symphonies, which were really, really stylish and lovely. As I recall, I haven't heard him in decades, so we'll have to give it a shot. But and he did an amazing disc of Torino orchestral music, also for RCA, towards the end of his life. Really, just a wonderful guy and a solid musician. Then we've got Charles Groves, who I've talked about many times on this channel. He was a terrific conductor. He did the first Mahler cycle in England, as if anybody cares. But his recorded legacy is almost entirely British music, with some Sibelius and other things. But he did marvelous Delius and Havergal Bryan and just Elgar and all kinds of really nifty stuff. It's in a big box. I enjoy his recordings. They're so full of spontaneous excitement and passion and just thrilling. And after Charles Groves, here's a name that's come up a million times. André Cluytens. Yes, good old André Cluytens. Big box of André Cluytens on EMI. He made fabulous Debussy and Ravel with the Paris Conservatory Orchestra. He did a famous Beethoven cycle with the Berlin Philharmonic. He was a terrific all-around musician. But the question was, in doing this series, where do you put him? It's a real issue. He was a generalist, yes, but he wasn't in the top 10 of the generalists. It's not that he was bad at anything. He was good at just about everything. He did very good Berlioz. He did Roussel. He did, some of these people were really, really fine all-around musicians. But there are a lot of really fine all-around musicians. And so he kept getting bounced off the list. Not because he was any worse particularly, but because there were certain names that had to be on the list, and you have to draw the line somewhere. You just got to draw the line. So he's back. André Cluytens. I hope you're all happy. He deserves mention. He definitely deserves mention. Kurt Sanderling. Oh, my goodness. And this Kurt Sanderling also includes all of the other kids that are conductors. Michael Sanderling, Thomas Sanderling. It's sort of the whole family, one happy family. And because they sort of do the same things, and they do them very well. He was a friend of Shostakovich. He did wonderful Shostakovich, but he was also one of those sort of crotchety German Kapellmeister types. He did an amazing Brahms symphony cycle with the Staatskapelle Dresden. His Beethoven symphonies were dreadful. He could be on or off, hot or cold. He could be quite stiff and a little bit stodgy. But he also did wonderful recordings for Berlin Classics. And his Mahler was, he did 9/10 in Das Lied von der Erde, one of the great Mahler 10s. Really, really a wonderful, wonderful gifted guy. A terrific Beethoven piano concerto cycle with Mitsuko Uchida. Really first rate. So another one we have to mention that a lot of you have come up with, Václav Talich. He was one of the sort of founders of the Czech Philharmonic. He put it on the map and built a great orchestra, got into trouble with the communist authorities, and was removed from his post, as a result of which his discographic legacy is smaller than it should have been. And it's almost entirely Czech. There's some Mozart and some other things, but mostly he did Smetana, Dvorak, Janacek, that kind of thing. Suk, very, very well, powerfully well. And he was a very gifted and excellent conductor. All of his legacy is mono, or just about all. I think it is all mono. And sometimes the sound is a little iffy, but it's wonderful to hear the Czech Philharmonic from the 30s and 40s and 50s. And he definitely deserves to be on a list. Here he is. Let's see who else. Oh, Ataulfo Argenta, the fabulous Spanish conductor. His discography for Decca, which is where he basically recorded, is pretty slender. And it has some wonderful things in it, a lot of Spanish music, as you might expect, because he was Spanish. But he really made his career conducting zarzuela performances. And there are a lot of those on Spanish Hispavox or Spanish RCA and labels like that. And, he was so talented. And unfortunately, he died. He was suffocated in a garage where he had his car on with the door down. Whether it was a suicide or an accident, I'm not sure anybody ever knew. But he was quite young when he passed away. But still, a name worth getting to know. There you go. With a lot of fine recordings. Oh, we're staying with Spanish people. Jesus Lopez-Cobos. He passed away rather recently. He made excellent recordings for Telarc with the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, and a bunch of fine recordings for Decca as well. Again, mostly of Spanish music, but that's okay. Spanish music is totally fabulous. He was an elegant conductor. He actually did very good Mahler. So it's not all Spanish. He was an elegant conductor, a person of refined sensibility, but also plenty of energy. And because he was doing all that Spanish stuff, rhythmic snap. So it's just wonderful. And after Kobos, another one who killed himself, Herbert Kegel. Herbert Kegel was a choral conductor originally. I think it was the Leipzig Radio Chorus was his chorus, or one of those things. He recorded in East Germany. He was a modern music specialist. He was a wonderful, unsentimental, serious German conductor. Let's just put it that way. And he did a very fine Beethoven cycle that was originally released on Capriccio. And some of his other, he did the War Requiem. He did all kinds of interesting things, some wonderful Stravinsky, and amazing things with chorus, including a fantastic Carmina Burana and its two sequels, Cotuli Carmina and the Triunfo di Aphrodite. Really, really amazing. When he had a chorus and an orchestra, watch out. His Court Viol, Seven Deadly Sins with Gisela Mai is a knockout. Herbert Kegel is a guy worth looking into and collecting. He really is. Even his Parsifal, which is very quick. Yes. Was very, very interesting. Always thoughtful. Ivan Fischer. Yeah, no one's mentioned him, which kind of surprises me, actually. He's been making fabulous records. He's raised the Budapest Festival Orchestra to remarkable heights. He's a chord guy. I mean, he's into beauty of sound, gorgeous string playing, really gorgeous string playing. And he's got a fabulous discography on Channel Classics with almost a Mahler cycle, and some of which is very good, some of which is not so good, and some other symphonies, Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, all kinds of stuff. And most of it extremely beautifully done, and certainly worth listening to and magnificently recorded by Channel Classics. So Ivan Fischer really deserves a shout out, and not a single one of you said so. Shame on you. Dmitri Mitropoulos. Okay. Mitropoulos is a cult conductor. He's in my list of cult conductors, but he was a major force in the first half of the 20th century. He really was. He led the New York Philharmonic and other major orchestras and was a very, very interesting character. He was high tension, always he was a quick conductor. He was fast and he was exciting, and he memorized everything, and he was a contemporary music icon. He did all kinds of modern music. He did the first recording of Wozzeck. It was just wonderful with Eileen Farrell and other people like that. I mean, really just terrific. A guy who has his fan base, but he really deserves more than that because he's made some amazing recordings. Mendelssohn's Scottish Symphony, Shostakovich 10, Prokofiev Romeo and Juliet suites. There's a whole list of things he did that was really remarkable. So yes, Mitropoulos goes on the list. Then Antoni Wit, who is still with us, Polish conductor, has spent most of his career conducting in Poland, and he also specializes in large choral masterworks. He's got the best recording of Mahler's Eighth. He's done all the Penderecki pieces, at least as well, or if not better, than Penderecki. The Dvorak Requiem, Janacek's Glagolitic Mass, and a bunch of other things besides. He tends to be a more deliberate conductor. He's very, very sober and very thoughtful, but his recordings are at a very, very high level, extremely high level. They're mostly on Naxos, and he's definitely a name that you should be sort of going through and checking out. And after Antoni Wit, Paul Kletzki. Paul Kletzki his career flourished in the 50s and 60s. He recorded mostly for EMI, times for Decca. He was a good all-around conductor. He did a really fabulous Beethoven cycle with the Czech Philharmonic, which we've been talking about. Actually, I've used it for samples in many of these videos, so you've had an opportunity to hear it. Those of you who took my word for it and got his Beethoven cycle with the Czech Philharmonic on Superphone have been very happy. Really, really, really happy. He also was an early proponent of Mahler with an excellent Fourth Symphony and Das Lied von der Erde. The first and the ninth had cuts, and they weren't so good. But another guy who had serious chops as a conductor, but who doesn't get a lot of attention now. So he belongs on the list. Oh, here's someone I have to talk about. He's still alive. Osmo Venska. Osmo Venska was an exciting conductor when he was with the Lahti Symphony, and then he went to Minnesota, and he started getting terribly micromanagey and mannered, and unfortunately, and that disfigured his Mahler cycle and his third Sibelius cycle, or however many he did. He did a couple of them, but he was a linchpin of the Bis Sibelius edition, and he made lots and lots of recordings of an unusual and interesting Finnish composers in Lahti, including Uno Klami and Kalevi Aho, and people like that. And they were marvelous. They are marvelous. Absolutely marvelous. He's a very good conductor when he lets go. How he's going to evolve in the future, it's worth paying attention to. He's somebody who's worth following because he's also got the ability. It's just a question of whether he'll pull it together and express it reliably. Another one that you all mentioned, well, a couple of you mentioned, was Howard Hanson, a great composer, conductor. He did his own music marvelously. He was a fine composer, but he spent most of his career on Mercury Living Presence, conducting wonderful American music by fabulous American composers as part of the Eastman School. He was the director of the Eastman Rochester Conservatory in upstate New York. And, oh, those recordings are so much fun. There's so much good music on them. Just tons and tons of them. You just need to know he's the conductor, and you know it's worth listening to. But he also did Ernest Bloch. It's very fine performances of Ernest Bloch and other things with what was basically a student orchestra. It was the student and faculty of the Eastman Conservatory, and they sounded great. Not a big orchestra, but they made great records. Absolutely great records. Maurice Abravanel. How could we not talk about Maurice Abravanel with the Utah Symphony on Vanguard and Vox? I mean, he built the Utah Symphony into something special. The concert hall there is named after him. He made tons of records that were inexpensive, that a lot of us who couldn't afford, the high-end classical people bought Abravanel in Utah. And they were really good. He did Sibelius cycles, Brahms cycles, Tchaikovsky cycles. I mean, he had an omnivorous appetite for unusual repertoire. He did terrific Vaughan Williams, and Darius Milhaud and French things, and there's just Honegger and Verez. He was really remarkable considering what he had to work with, and just how amazingly he did. We need badly to have some sort of systematic release of Abravanel's recordings on Vanguard and Vox, because they were wonderful. Honegger's oratorios, King David and Joan of Arc, au boucher, Joan of Arc at the stake. These were great. And we had access to all this stuff when we were, without much money, when we were young. And, oh, God, it was great growing up with this stuff. Stanislaw Skrowaczewski. Now, there's somebody who a lot of you have mentioned as composer-conductor, number one, or just as a wonderful conductor because he did great Bruckner. He has the reference Bruckner cycle. He was an amazing Bruckner conductor, and I saw him do a bit of it. He was a guest conductor in Baltimore when I was there in undergrad, and I saw him do an amazing Eighth Symphony with a tam-tam added to the second cymbal crash. Yay! He was just fabulous in that music, and his complete cycle is wonderful, but he also did great Ravel and great Stravinsky and Prokofiev, and really an all-around composer's, he had the eye of a composer. He was a bit like Jean Martineau, even Pierre Boulez, those composer-conductors who really brought a keen musical intelligence and sharp eye to what they did, and his legacy is pretty outstanding. It really is. I don't think he was as great like Beethoven and Brahms. He was at Halle for a while, and he did some fairly uninteresting things there. But, every one of these guys, like I said, had their hits and misses. They all do, right? They all do. Joseph Keilberth, wonderful, cranky old German Kapellmeister type, famous for his Wagner performances, and some beautiful Bruckner and Beethoven, for Teldec and other labels. He's somebody you see him in Wagner circles because he did an amazing recording of The Ring, so it's right over here, isn't it? Is that the one? Yes, this is the one. It's supposed to be actually. Wait a minute, let me just haul it out here. There it is. Yes, Keilberth. It was recorded live at the Bayreuth Festival in stereo in 1955 with an amazing cast: Astrid Varnay, all the usual ringy people, Gustav Niedlinger, and who else is in it? Ramon Vinet and Wolfgang Wingas, and yes, okay, we all know. But Keilberth made few, orchestral recordings, or not as many as he's known as an opera conductor, but they're worth listening to. They're part of that wonderful sort of German middle tradition. He wasn't crazy, wacky. He wasn't, stiff or stilted. It was just the way music was done there in the first half of the 20th century, for the most part, or the beginning of the stereo era. And so he's a wonderful sort of avatar of that tradition. Then there's Klaus Tennstedt. So many of you mentioned Klaus Tennstedt. Klaus Tennstedt's problem was that he canceled almost every concert he ever scheduled, or a lot of them, and he was terribly inconsistent. When he was hot, he could be incandescent. He was much better live than he was on recordings. He did a complete Mahler cycle. You know how he got out of East Germany, don't you? You know, they accidentally stamped his passport with a visa. I mean, to let him go. And he was going on a trip somewhere or whatever, and he just took one look at it, just kept going. I mean, he was like, well, I'm out. And so he had, a few years in the West. He became conductor of the London Philharmonic, and made a very patchy series of recordings. Some people just swear by his, like Richard Strauss and things like that. But again, there's other people who did better. When he, like I said, when he was hot, he was amazing. But there's not a lot of the amazing, unfortunately. There really isn't. But that's why he sort of has a cult of people who, burrow through everything he did and look for live stuff and try and listen to things in the hope that they'll catch him at his best. And sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. So he's worth listening to for his best. Here's one you probably haven't thought about, Serge Baudo. He was actually the cellist, I believe, Paul Tortellier's nephew, if I'm not mistaken. And he's best known for recordings of French repertoire that he did with the Czech Philharmonic, actually on Superphone. An amazing Honegger symphony cycle. Not that people care about Honegger terribly much. A lot of that sort of wonderful Les Six 20th century French music guy. I've never heard a poor recording of his. He was wonderfully attuned to whatever he recorded. And he seemed to record only things that really fit his stylistic parameters. So he's a guy worth looking out for. His recordings are really, really, really good. His Debussy was terrific. He was fine artist. Franz Bruggen, period instrument guy. Well, yes. The thing that was fun about Franz Bruggen is that technically he was a flute player. Flute players are crazy. Technically, he was a period instrument guy, but he was sort of like the Furtwängler of the period instrument movement. I mean, his conducting was all over the place. It was so anachronistic that you had these people with period instruments, but they were also conductors in the wildest romantic sense. I mean, the whole thing was bizarre, but he was fun to listen to. He really was, and he did a fantastic series of Haydn symphonies, Sturm und Drang symphonies, and then the Paris and London symphonies, and they are wonderful. With the orchestra of the 18th century, I think it was, on period instruments, but full of life and color, and he also did a Beethoven cycle and other things, and Mozart and all the usual stuff. But in the classical period, for his work in the classical period, he's just a ton of fun. He really is, and definitely worth checking out for his Haydn. Then there's Václav Neumann, who was Karl Ancherl's successor at the Czech Philharmonic. Now, Neumann's discography is huge. He's got a Mahler cycle, which has some stunning recordings in it, some really, really good ones. He's got 2 Dvorak cycles, including the analog one, which is better than the later digital remake, which is absolutely first class. He focused mostly, as you might expect, on Czech music. He accompanied a lot of Czech artists like Ivan Moravec and that crew. He was a beloved leader of the Czech Philharmonic and was involved quite heavily in the overthrow of the communist regime there, when the Czech Philharmonic went on strike and caused sort of this national crisis that eventually brought down the regime. It's a very, very interesting story. And he passed away shortly thereafter. He conducted too much, too long. I mean, at the end of his life, he was mentally a little bit shady, and I think that showed in some of his recordings. They were terribly stiff. And kind of slow. A couple of things. He started remaking the Mahler symphonies, for example. But what a fine musician. And under his tutelage in works like Martinu, he did all the symphonies, and Janacek, the orchestra retained its character, which it has since lost under Semyon Bychkov, it seems to be. So Neumann is a name. He also, by the way, started out with the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, where he made them do Mahler and a lot of Czech music, the Slavonic dances and things, and they did it very well. So that was really kind of cool. Rafael Frubeck de Burgos, of course. Now, Rafael Frubeck de Burgos is a splendid Spanish conductor who was around until fairly recently, actually. if I'm not mistaken, because he did make a wonderful recording of Liszt tone poems for Bis about 10 years ago or so, 15 years ago maybe. He was best known for his EMI recordings of Manuel de Falla and other Spanish composers. He did the best El Amor Brujo with Nati Mistral on Decca. He also was a terrific choral conductor. He did fabulous Mendelssohn Elijah and Carmina Burana and stuff like that. Really, really, really good conductor of large choral works. And we need a box. We need a Frubeck de Burgos box. He was really a first-class musician. Leif Segerstam. Oh, I loved Leif Segerstam because I played under him in our album Earquake on Ondine, which has Hekla by Jan Leifs, the volcanic eruption in which I was special guest anvil soloist under Maestro Segerstam. He was out of his mind. He wrote like 372 horrible symphonies. We talked about him in the composer-conductor section there, but he was a wonderful conductor. He could be eccentric. He did a kind of odd Mahler cycle on Chandos in Denmark, and he did a really trudgy Sibelius cycle, then a fabulous one with the Helsinki Philharmonic on Ondine. He did all of the Sibelius incidental music, a wonderful series on Naxos. He was a violinist. He cared a lot about string tone and string playing. He recorded Radhavara. He was just a fine musician all around, and just a real character. Some of his stuff is kind of strange, but a lot of it is absolutely wonderful. Another conductor nobody has mentioned, which I think is kind of sad, David Zinman, who has done fabulous work with the Tonhalle Orchestra of Zurich and also for Telarc with the Baltimore Symphony. I mean, he did an amazing Elgar Enigma variations, Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony, and stuff like that on Telarc. He was one of the first modern conductors of regular orchestras to jump on the period instrument bandwagon and do the Urtext edition of the Beethoven symphonies, which personally I didn't think were all that hot, but I mean, they're good. But his Beethoven concertos and other things with Yefim Bronfman are state of the art. Amazing. So is his Schumann Symphony Cycle. There was a huge box. He was on Arte Nova of like all the stuff he did. He did all the Strauss tone poems. He did a Mahler cycle. He did all of these things. Some very, very good, some not quite so good, but he's a modern guy. He's clean, neat, exciting, rhythmic, very contemporary. Some of his Phillips recordings in Rotterdam were also wonderful. Rimsky-Korsakov opera suites, one of the best Russian Easter overtures and Antar symphonies you'll ever hear. So yeah, there's a lot there, and he deserves the credit for it. And after him, Kirill Kondrashin. Well, Kondrashin is legendary for doing the first Shostakovich Symphony Cycle, which has, again, some very good things and some less good things. He also did a stunning, reference recording of Rachmaninoff, The Bells, which is just intense beyond belief, absolutely glorious. But he defected to the West and then passed away very soon thereafter, unfortunately. But not before doing an amazing Scheherazade with the Concertgebouw, a great New World Symphony with the Vienna Philharmonic. He was just a great all-around conductor. And unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to have a golden age in the West. His discography isn't huge, but it's very distinguished. It really is. Michel Plasson. None of you mentioned him. How dare you? The nerve. You people have such chutzpah not to talk about Plasson. He was the French guy with his Toulouse Orchestra, which was never a great orchestra, by the way. Well, not terrible. They always got sort of, mossy recordings. They were always a little bit diffuse and, lacking in transparency. But he did a lot of 20th century and late 18th century French music, tons of French operas. Magnard operas and Gounod oratorios and all that kind of stuff. And he did it very, very well. He was quite reliable. He also did, a Honegger Symphony Cycle and other more normal things, Saint-Saëns and, all the usual culprits, Carmen, But there were two huge EMI boxes of his material, and seeing it all in one place was very, very impressive. People had issues with the orchestra and with his own, dynamism as a leader. I think that, for most of the things where there was competition, you could find better ones. But that doesn't mean he was bad. He wasn't. It was all at a very solid professional level, and it introduced so much of us to music we never would have heard otherwise. Orchestral works by people like Dan Dee, and just a huge list of very, very interesting stuff. Peter Maag. Peter Maag is famous for one Mendelssohn disc on Decca, containing the Scottish Symphony and Fingal's Cave and some Midsummer Night's Dream stuff. They stuck it all in one CD. He also did lovely Mozart. He later on did a complete Mendelssohn Symphony cycle. It wasn't quite as good as his first Mendelssohn stuff, and a Beethoven Symphony cycle in Italy. Maag was interesting because he quit conducting for a long, long period of time to go to Tibet and study Zen Buddhism and find himself and get in touch with his spiritual inner being and all of that stuff. And a lot of people say, "Oh, what a shame, what a pity, isn't it, Trent?" No, it's not a shame. That's the point. So he's not going to be on a list of the top 20 conductors in the history of the universe. What he did was often very distinguished. Some was not, as like everybody else. And he, by all accounts, had a satisfying and happy and fulfilling life, which is frankly more important than, just churning out recordings one after the other. It's always common to say, "Oh, if only they'd done more." I'm just happy with what exists. I really am, because I know, as I said in the historical recording talk, which got so many people hysterical, there's always going to be somebody else who's going to do it just as well or better, maybe a little different. But we're not short. There's no shortage of any of this stuff, is there? Look at this list of conductors. After Peter Maag, Erich Leinsdorf with the Boston Symphony primarily. Leinsdorf was a terrific opera conductor. Remember, he did the Birgit Nilsson, Jussi Björling Turandot. He bankrupted RCA recording Lohengrin. Ha, ha, ha. It's a great story. But he made tons of recordings with the Boston Symphony. RCA insisted that Boston take Leinsdorf. Apparently, they would have wanted at the time to get William Steinberg earlier, but they got Leinsdorf, and he wasn't a bad conductor. In fact, he was a very solid all-around conductor. I mean, he did a very good Beethoven cycle. He did the Prokofiev symphonies. He did a bunch of Mahler symphonies. He did all kinds of stuff. Those were not so interesting to me. I never found his Prokofiev symphonies to be terribly appealing, or his Mahler for that matter. But his Beethoven's quite good. His Mozart was quite good. And he did some very interesting contemporary repertoire, which still has not been released, which is why we need a Leinsdorf box. Particularly the Hinistera First Piano Concerto and Variaciones Concertantes. Oh my God, was that a great record. Unbelievable. So we need to be able to reappraise him. There's some stuff on Decca that he did as well. But he's ripe for reappraisal, let's put it that way. After Leinsdorf, Frederick Fennell. Oh, why haven't all of you brass people out there? I know you trombonists and tubists and all this. None of you mentioned Frederick Fennell. He was the god of band music. Really, from his early days with Mercury Living Presence, and then on Telarc, and then he was in Japan with, what was that, or the Tokyo Kosei Wind Ensemble, whatever it was called. He made disc after disc after disc of fantastic band music. And you've just got to have Frederick. If you see the name, you get the disc. If you're interested in band music, it's that simple. So he really ought to be probably in the top 20 conductors of all time. But he was a specialist. Boy, was he a specialist! I could have put him on the specialist list. I probably should have. It would have occasioned more chatter. But he is major. Absolutely as major as it gets. Then Witold Rowicki, the Polish conductor. Well, Rowicki was famous for doing the Rachmaninoff Second Piano Concerto with Sviatoslav Richter. That was like a big deal. But he also did Dvorak symphonies, very fine Dvorak symphonies, and a bunch of other. He wasn't as popular in the West as some others, and he didn't do all that much. But what he did do was really good. I mean, his Dvorak cycle for Phillips was as great as the Kertész it was both. They were both with the London Symphony, and the performances, the interpretations are very, very different. Rowicki is very quick and energetic, except in the seventh, which is a little soggy. And so they're again, he's a name. Keep it in mind. Think about it. He also did Polish stuff, Szymanowski and people like that, and quite nicely. John Barbirolli. Well, he was a cult conductor, so he was already on the list of cult conductors. But I had to put him here as well because he was a wonderfully lovable conductor who made lots and lots and lots of recordings, and he was maddeningly inconsistent. I mean, he did the right things for all the right human reasons. That doesn't mean the musical results were fabulous. I mean, people talk about how he, gave up his career at the New York Philharmonic, which was actually failing pretty dramatically. Not his fault, by the way. It was the circumstances. Succeeding Toscanini and then, the whole American messed up political scene. But the bottom line is he left to take over the Halle Orchestra, which was, everyone says, on its last legs when he got it, a fourth-rate orchestra that after, as I say, years of laborious efforts, he raised to the third rate, which was never better than that. Very rarely when he had them. Most of his best recordings were done in London with the major London orchestras. I mean, it's just a fact. Much as everybody loves him for, sticking by Halle, and it was a wonderful thing he did. And they're a wonderful orchestra now, largely because of the preparation work that he did in the 50s, the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But the recordings are so iffy. There's some wonderful Sibelius, not the symphonies, but tone poems and other things. There's some wonderful Elgar. And in his not Halle stuff, I mean, he did great. He did some great Mahler. He did fabulous English string music and Vaughan Williams and all that English stuff. It was wonderful. He did an incredible Madame Butterfly. He had the gift of spontaneity and passion. His Sibelius second with the Royal Phil, not with Halle, was amazing. And so for those recordings, his name will live on. But, and I did a review of the big box, which I advise you to listen to the video, go take a look at it, 80 some odd CDs or whatever it was. And I came away, very, very favorably impressed with the man. Not individual performances so much, but with the body of work as a whole. After Barbirolli, Eliahu Inbal. My goodness, doesn't he deserve some recognition? He was a wonderful conductor. I mean, he is a wonderful conductor. He's spent most of his time in the Far East since doing he recorded for Denon, let's put it that way, from the very beginning. And he did a terrific Mahler cycle and some splendid Berlioz and some very good Janacek. And he's a passionate, exciting guy. He's redone his Mahler cycle in Japan, which is very expensive, so I don't bother with it. I'm not going to spend a fortune to get, the same thing all over again. But he's got the chops. And his recordings have not been promoted as much as they probably deserve to be, because that Mahler cycle is one of the best. It really is first class, with Frankfurt Radio. And he did Gurlieder, and he just did a lot of very, very good things. He did a Shostakovich cycle that sucked. It was with the Vienna Symphony, and they just weren't the right orchestra, let's put it that way. Although even that had some good performances. It really did. So Eliahu Inbal is worth thinking about. We're getting towards the end. I think we're in the last, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 more. 8 more. That's all. Just 8 more. Jerzy Bielochlawek, who recently passed away, was a wonderful conductor in a gentle vein. He was a sweet soul. Late in his life, he did Dvorak cycles for Decca, and all those recordings were just awful. Dvorak and Janacek. Before that, he did a lot of that music, and extremely well. He was a wonderful conductor of Martinu. That was sort of his prime composer. I mean, people would say, who cares about Martinu conducting? Well, you should, because Martinu was a great composer, a very great composer. And Bielochlawek's recordings of his music were first class. We could really do with a Martinu box with Bielochlawek on Superphone. That would be fun, really fun. And he did Joseph Suk, and he did, all the usual Czech culprits. And his Chandos recordings were often very beautiful. And his Superphone stuff was very good. It was just if it was something that was sort of expressionistic or that required a lot of tension or or sort of rhythmic discipline. Well, that wasn't his thing. His Brahms was kind of soggy, but his serenades were fabulous on Superfon. And so there's well, like I said, worth exploring. So you can explore. And after Bill 11, Horst Stein. I don't know why nobody thinks about Horst Stein anymore, but those recordings keep popping up, and they're good. I mean, he did Sibelius tone poems with the Orchestre de la Suisse Romande very, very well. He did some beautiful Bruckner recordings. They're all for Decca, or mostly for Decca. There's not a ton of it. It's a small legacy. But I don't think he ever made a bad record. I mean, most of what I've heard him do has been very, very fine. He's in the Vienna Philharmonic Bruckner cycle, the one that's on Australian Eloquence, Decca Eloquence. And you hear he's really, really good on top of his game. And like I said, the Sibelius and some other things that he did, first class. So if you see him, don't ignore him. Just know that he's out there. And if you have a chance and you come across something and you want to give it a shot, give it a shot. Who was that? Erich Kleiber. Good old Erich Kleiber. The problem with Erich Kleiber is everybody admits he was a totally great conductor, actually better than his son Carlos, frankly, in most respects. His discography is tiny. He did a couple operas. He did, Rosenkavalier and Don Giovanni, or The Marriage of Figaro, or something, I don't even remember. And he did some Beethoven symphonies and a few other things. There was a larger discography of 78s, early stuff, which sounds mostly dreadful. But his mono and, last recordings, one stereo opera recording, I believe, right? The Marriage of Figaro, I think it was really, really, really first class. He was a wonderful conductor in the Toscanini mold, which is what his son was as well. Who has a cult, I hear from my European friends. Oh, well, he didn't make the cult list either, Carlos. But he made my list of most annoying conductors, so that's, most of the cult conductors are annoying as well, so it all works out. But Erich Kleiber is great, and you should get the little Erich Kleiber box and listen to his wonderful Beethoven and Mozart, and it's delightful. It's just a very limited discography. Istvan Kertész. Yes, good old Istvan. Istvan drowned swimming in Israel when he was also fairly young. He was a house conductor, essentially, for Decca. He did the reference recording of the Dvorak symphonies in the West, which was really quite fine, and other Dvorak stuff like the Requiem and the tone poems. I mean, he really did. He did wonderful Hungarian music. He was Hungarian. He accompanied Julius Katchen in some dynamic and wonderful piano concerto recordings. He did a very solid Brahms cycle with the Vienna Philharmonic. He was a really good all-around conductor. A little lazy, didn't like to rehearse very much, which is, it's a lovable fault if the results are as musical as his often were. His stuff has been issued in a couple boxes by Decca. They had Kertész in London and Kertész in Vienna and, Kertész in Mongolia, whatever it was. So his recordings haven't been hard to find, and they are worth finding for the most part. Otmar Suitner. Yeah, Otmar Suitner made the list of Kenneth Wood's list of 20 greatest conductors, which was very funny. He was an East German Kapellmeister type who made beautiful recordings of a lot of stuff. I mean, he did a great Dvorak cycle, fabulous Dvorak cycle, and wonderful recordings of everything from like the Bizet Symphony in C to some Richard Strauss things, an amazing Rite of Spring with the Staatskapelle Dresden, a fabulous recording of Salome, with Crystal Goltz as Salome, who was way past her prime. Such a pity because the orchestral part is just fabulous. But nobody really knew who he was. He became famous for 10 minutes because Denon had a relationship with the Deutsche not the Staatskapelle Berlin, but the Deutsche Schallplatten. Thank you. East German radio and the East German national record label. And they released his Beethoven cycle. It was the first Beethoven cycle on CD. And everyone ran out and bought it. Everybody ran. And then, we were all listening to it going, well, it's okay. It wasn't bad. It wasn't thrilling. He did a lot of other things better, but it was the first. And everyone, for 10 minutes, everybody knew who Otmar Suitner was. And then he sank back into obscurity. And my good friend Christophe Huss at Le Devoir in Montreal, when he was at Repertoire magazine, he was the editor in France, he wanted to do an interview with Otmar Suitner. And I remember he told me, Suitner said, why? Who wants to hear from me? But he was a very, very good, one of those well-trained, terrific German musicians. Like Sanderling and Keilberth and Kempe. I mean, they were Joachim was another one. There was a school of German conductors who just really knew what they were doing. They had the training. They grew up through the opera house system and went into orchestral music from vocal music, and they just understood the vocal essence of our music, Western music, very, very well. After Otmar Suitner, another one you mentioned a lot, Eduard van Beinum. Van Beinum died very young and tragically. He was conducting Brahms' first, I think, and he had a heart attack. He conducted the Concertgebouw. He took over after the disgraced Mengelberg was booted, and he was as different a conductor as you could possibly get. He was a sincere, musical, straightforward, no nonsense musician down to his fingertips. I think he was an oboist. Wind players always make wonderful conductors. So was Kempe. And he did incredible Brahms, wonderful Bruckner, really good Mahler, all in a very emotionally somewhat reserved style. But it's very, very powerful. And Decca released a big Van Beinum box. It's all been released now. So you can go and you can sample and you can have a good time. He did some wonderful concerto accompaniments, Beethoven with Arthur Grumio, I believe, or was it Brahms? I don't know, it's something like that. I'm doing this all off the top of my head, so please be nice to me. A great conductor, really a great conductor, but mostly mono, not so well known, and depending on when the stuff was recorded. Some of it's very, very, very good and very powerful, and some of it was just okay. It's just okay. Then there's William Steinberg, who gets a lot of play on this channel, tons and tons of it, who was with the Pittsburgh Symphony and should have gotten the Boston Symphony. He was a wonderful artist. He was just simply a wonderful artist. He was the guy who got me into classical music. His Beethoven Pastoral Symphony with the Bruegel harvesters on the cover, that just blew my mind when I was like 5, when I was first learning to read. And I asked my mom, what does pastoral mean? And she said, look at the picture and listen to the music. And I did. And I was hooked. And that was Steinberg. He has a wonderful discography on EMI, which badly needs remastering and reissuing. Certainly, the stuff that he did that on Command Classics is owned by Universal, which has released his Brahms cycle and his Beethoven cycle. Both have outstanding performances in them. The sonics are they weren't great in that hall, but he was a wonderful conductor. And last but not least, here we go. Finally, number 40, believe it or not, Paavo Järvi. Yes, you were all saying, where's Paavo Järvi? You talked about Niemi. Where's Paavo? Well, there's Paavo. Terrific conductor. He's still making his way. It's hard to, you can't judge the guy at this point. He's done some great things. There's that wonderful box of stuff he did when he was in Cincinnati that was recorded for Telarc. That's absolutely first class. He did an amazing Beethoven cycle with the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie Bremen, although he did Beethoven overtures that weren't nearly as good. He seems to blow hot and cold for me. He's doing a Mahler cycle on Alpha. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. I'll tell you a secret. The 5th, which is what he started with. So many people start with Mahler 5. It's really good. It's really good. But we'll give it a detailed review later. We'll see how well that goes. But he did a Sibelius cycle. It was quite mediocre with French orchestra, and that's a big mistake. He's done Bruckner. He's done a lot of stuff for RCA in Europe that hasn't been released internationally. I don't know why. What's the point of recording a Bruckner cycle, basically, if you're not going to release it internationally? But his Bruckner hasn't been fabulous either. So he's on the list. He's on the list, and he's making records, which is what's important, all over the place. And hopefully, when we evaluate his body of work, it will be increasingly more like the best of it than like the worst of it or the least of it. It all remains to be seen. So there's your list, my friends. 40 conductors who are either, well, what did I call this? Let's see. 40 noteworthy but mostly dead conductors with loads of recordings worth exploring. So it's all up to you now. You've got the tools. Go forth and spelunk through the fabulous world of classical music. Keep on listening, friends. Take care.